Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing our lecture on learning and memory part 1. So now we're going to move into the process of memory storage and how we kind of form memories conceptually. So let's acknowledge that we're constantly getting so much input. So our sensory system, as we've discussed, is constantly bringing things in. So if you're watching this video right now, you're seeing me talk, you're seeing the slide, you're reading the slide, you're you're hearing my voice, you're feeling the chair pushing up against your bottom or wherever you are. Perhaps your phone is buzzing next to you. You're maybe feeling that what you're clothing on your body feels like, or maybe you've got an eyelash in your eye. All this sensory information is constantly coming in, and then our thalamus is going to be triaging and deciding what makes it to our cerebral cortex and makes us consciously aware of it, right? And some of that sensory input is going to get coded into memory, but most won't. So some of it we will remember briefly or for a longer period of time, and some won't. The image down below is from a documentary on Hulu called Sensory Overload, about kind of neurodivergent folks and other people who are very sensitive to sensory. We think they have a little bit of trouble kind of triaging and filtering out the stuff that is unimportant. I don't have Hulu, so I haven't seen it, but I thought it looked interesting. So if you have Hulu, maybe check it out. So the first thing that happens if we're going to remember something is we might put it in our short-term or working memory. So here's an inconsistent terminology alert. So our two textbooks use short-term memory as something that's distinct from working memory. And the one textbook talks about how working memory is kind of like short-term memory on steroids, where you have things that you'll remember for a few seconds to minutes, is your short-term memory. And then if you're manipulating it and doing things with it, like we'll do in lab with the digit span test, then they call that working memory. Other authors refer to these as the same exact thing, so just know it's a temporary storage. So you will remember what I just said for seconds to minutes in the absence of you then coding it into a different thing, and then you will forget it. And this is happening, we know, in the prefrontal cortex. And the reason why we know it happens in the prefrontal cortex is because people who have suffered injury or infection or damage to that part of the brain have difficulty with this short-term working memory. So it only lasts seconds to minutes, and you can only hold about 7 discrete pieces of information in your brain at a time. That is the reason why phone numbers are 7 digits, right? So 8675309, that's in my long-term memory because of a lot of repetition, and it's set to music. But phone numbers were set at 7 numbers because that was generally felt what somebody could hold in their head for a moment while they were then dialing the phone. Then we had to add area codes, all those kinds of things, but about 7 at a time, and for seconds to minutes, and then it's gone unless you encode it to hold on to it for longer. So that encoding is where you then transfer it to your long-term memory. So you can see here in the infographic, right, you have this input. Some of it will go into your short-term memory in your prefrontal cortex, where you can maybe work with it and do things with it or remember it for seconds to minutes. And then if you want to hold on to it for longer than that, you're going to encode it. And we know that that process involves the hippocampus, again, because of case studies of people that have had damage for one reason or another to that part of their brain. And so that information then is going to get encoded into your long-term memory and stored and strengthened via a process called consolidation. And research suggests that a lot of that consolidation happens while we are asleep. So when we get to our sleep unit, we'll talk about this again, but it's also one of the reasons why I will tell my students over and over again how important it is to make sure you get enough sleep, because actually a lot of your encoding and storing of your memories happens while you're asleep. So if you are not getting enough sleep, you're missing out on the brain's ability to hold on to the information that you have just learned. So the other thing that I want you to know is a little vocabulary term here called engram, sometimes called a memory trace. And that's a way of referring to the collections of neurons and their connections, or the network of things that are associated with a particular memory. So that's an engram. It's like this neuron and this neuron and this neuron and this neuron and this neuron are for this particular memory of Dr. Hall talking to me about encoding things into your long-term memory. So the most famous patient is patient HM, who had a terrible seizure disorder that was disabling. And so many seizures in people who have epilepsy originate or start in the temporal lobe. And so, you know, measure of last resort, they decided to do surgery to remove parts of the temporal lobe, so the medial part of the temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, which is located there, in order to treat his surgeries. And the good news is that it did significantly reduce his seizures. The bad news is that it significantly affected his memory. Now, they were not expecting that because at that point in time, this was in the 1950s, research in animals had suggested that our memories were distributed in all different parts of our brain. They weren't in one unique spot. So this was actually surprising to the researchers. So what did they find? Well, for one thing, he lost memories from 1 to 2 years before the surgery. Now, I will tell you that there is controversy over whether this was related to the surgery or perhaps some medications, some really heavy duty medications he had been on at the time that could also have interfered with formation of memories during those years. So we're not sure if that was due to the surgery or not. His childhood memories were intact. He didn't lose those old memories. So that kind of fits with this idea that our memories are, distributed in all these different parts of our brains and not one particular location. His short-term memory was also intact, which fits with what we know or other evidence suggests that it's in the prefrontal cortex. But he lost the ability to form new declarative memories. So he lost the ability to form new long-term memories of facts, right? So semantic and events, episodic. So for example, when he would come in to see his doctor, every single day, so like he was studied very closely. So every single day the doctor would have to reintroduce themselves. He would not know who this woman, actually. He was studied by a woman at MIT for many, many years. He would not recognize the scientist. He did not recognize his doctor. So every single day they had to reintroduce themselves. He could not form new declarative memories. But what was interesting is he could form new procedural memories. So this is what allowed us to figure out that the hippocampus is important not for necessarily it's not the place of the long-term storage of memories because that seems to be diffuse, right? But the hippocampus and this medial temporal lobe is important in moving things into long-term memory. So the hippocampus is important for encoding these declarative memories, but not important for encoding procedural or implicit memory. So one example is the star tracing task. So why a star? Why with the mirror? I don't know. They just came up with something that's not easy to do, but gets better with practice. So I don't know if you can tell in the photo here, but there's an outline of a star. And the person is given a marker, and then there's a little shield so that you can't look directly at the paper. Instead, you have to look at a mirror, and you have to trace the star while watching your hand in the mirror. That's really difficult to do at first, but with practice, you get better and better at it. So the fascinating thing about HM is that day after day, they would have him do this mirror tracing test, and he got better and better and better at it. Now, funnily enough, he couldn't form declarative memories, so he never knew. They had to explain to him the directions every single time. He had no memory of ever having done it before, and yet he would get better and better and better at it, and his time improved. Like he could do it 10 times faster by the end. So he was forming those procedural memories, but not declarative memories. He couldn't remember that he'd ever even done that task before. Fascinating. So I want to say a word about anterograde versus retrograde amnesia. So retro, it's going back. So if here is our event, right? So they have the big now, right? So here is the event. Something happens. You have surgery to remove part of your brain. If you have a concussion or a head injury, a retrograde amnesia means you would forget the things that happened before, but that you would be able to form new memories after. Whereas an anterograde, antero means moving forward, then you can form new memories of things that happened. So in the case of HM, it was the ability to form anterograde memories, right? So it was anterograde amnesia, so not able to form new memories. Didn't affect his old ones from childhood, at least. Those years before the surgery, we're not really sure what was going on there. Now, this is really interesting and is something that if you have trouble with amnesia, if anybody has trouble, with memory, doctors will try to figure out, which part of your memory, because that's different brain functions, different areas of the brain. It's also interesting because we can use it sometimes to our benefit. So a little example here is that there is a medication that's often given to patients who are going into the operating room. So if you've ever had a surgery, you may know that first you go into like the pre-op area, and that's where they like put in your IV, they check all your vital signs, they go over the procedure with you, they make sure everything is ready. So you hang out in the pre-op area until they do all those things, any blood tests or whatever they need to do, until the operating room and the surgeon are ready for you. And then they wheel you into the operating room, and believe it or not, you're on the stretcher. Then you have to scoot yourself over onto the operating table in the OR. And then, they'll make you unconscious then with the anesthesia. And then eventually, after your surgery is done, you get wheeled to the post-op area where then you kind of wake up from the anesthesia and they monitor you for a while. So that's the process. So why am I telling you this? So there's a drug that they often will give you in the pre-op area. No, I'm sorry, when you first get into the operating room. And so it's one of the anesthesia medicines that they give you, and it causes a little bit of retrograde amnesia. So what's really fun about that is you forget being wheeled into the OR. You forget scooching over onto the operating table. You don't remember any of that. So you experienced it, but you actually lose those most recent memories, which is kind of interesting. Kind of nice because it's weird. Okay. So where are those long-term memories stored? So that's a really good question. And it appears to be mostly diffuse in the cerebral cortex, okay? Now, there's this question because of HM's case, is the hippocampus or medial temporal lobe important for the first couple of years? One of our textbooks kind of posits that they kind of sit there in temporary storage for a couple of years before moving out. But other folks say, no, that was his medicine. So long-term memories seem to be distributed in all different places of your cerebral cortex. And there are these diffuse networks, right? It's not any one given place. Although we do know that emotional loading of memories, we do know that involves the amygdala. We've talked about the amygdala before. We also have talked about before that those non-declarative or implicit memories, if they're procedural for those muscle skills, right? We talked about how the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are places where those are housed and stored. And specifically, they talk about in the book the striatum. The striatum is a subpart of the basal ganglia. So we learned about those when we did motor system and when you learn the tap dance move, and that's where those appear to be stored. Okay, so we're constantly receiving sensory input. Some of it we decide to consciously be aware of, and some of it then gets stored into our short-term memory, which seems to be in the prefrontal cortex, where we can hold about 7 discrete pieces of information for seconds to minutes, depending on things that we might do to hold on to them a little bit longer. And then if we encode them into long-term memory and potentially consolidate and strengthen them, we're going to use our hippocampus to do that, right? HM lost his ability to do that. And that consolidation, much of it's going to happen during sleep, which is why sleep is so important for learning. And it's stored in various locations, right? So we think it's interconnected cortical networks. When I say cortical networks, we mean different parts of the cerebral cortex, right? In the different lobes for the declarative and explicit memories, but then in the striatum of the basal ganglia and the cerebellum for the procedural or skill memories. All right, I'll see you for 19C.